Well, you just jumped to history. Before we get to the history part, you say you got. I understand you came from Iran, this kind of feudal society, and that drew your interest to understanding medieval literature because it had some resonance with how you grew up. How do you get from there to pulling the story? I mean, you just jumped now to what was going on historically, but what was happening in you? You got curious. Something, like you said, something was different between these two.
Well, as I said, I was teaching Chaucer and Gower. And as I studied the language of Chaucer and Gower, I became aware that something happened to the language at their time. All of the records in England had been in French and Latin until 1400. After the Norman conquest, that was the standard language. English was a patois. Everybody in England was still speaking English, but if they ever sat down to write, they wrote in French or Latin. But suddenly after 1400, English writing began to appear. And that's when I realized that Henry IV and Henry V, in order to get the support of the ordinary people, had begun to use English for government, that it wasn't something that just happened automatically. It happened because the government wanted it to happen. Then I realized that Chaucer was a cousin of Henry V, and he was not royalty himself, but he knew the royalty very well. And so they used him as a model. And that's the reason that Chaucer became so important. And it's the way in which English was introduced as a standard language, as a government language. And people had been writing in English before that, but nobody had seen any sense of copying the English and making manuscripts in English because it wasn't a standard language. But after 1400, all of the Chaucer manuscripts we have, all of the Gower manuscripts we have, are after 1400. And so it became worthwhile to copy. This is 100 years before printing. But to make standard manuscripts of the English literature in English, and that's where standard English begins. First with government English, and then with the fact that it was important enough to make fine manuscripts of the literature in English.
So the first English writing is 700 AD or so, the beginnings of it.
Well, the Anglo-Saxons had a standard language. King Alfred and the Anglo-Saxons had a good standard language, and that's what we study for Anglo-Saxon. It's West Saxon, the West Saxon dialect, but it was very standard. But the Norman conquest did away with that. Until 1066, England had the first standard language in Europe. Before France, before Italy, before Spain, Old English had a standard language. But the Normans came in, introduced French and Latin. Everything from that time on was in French and Latin. And the Anglo-Saxon was ignored for another 500 years. It began to be studied again in the 17th century.
When you say Anglo-Saxon developed a standard, are you talking about a writing standard?
Oh, yes. All standard is writing. There is no such thing as standard speaking. You know, we're speaking the way that we write. Otherwise, we'd be speaking the way they speak up in the Tennessee hills or out in the Indiana countryside. All standard is writing. Standard speech is coming as close to standard writing as people feel they can come. But all standardization is in the written form, in any language.
We talked about this during our phone conversation.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of the things that there's a remarkable agreement because we recognize that based on word frequency counts and what have you, that the majority of the language used comes from writing. In other words, it's not acquired through oral language discourse. It's actually acquired through writing.
That's the reason that spelling reform won't work at all. You know, people can spell any way they want to. People will pronounce it any way they want to. It doesn't matter. With spelling reform, how would you spell there in Atlanta, and how would you spell there in Boston?
Yeah, well, relative to spelling reform, you know, the only reason to entertain any of that isn't for the proficient reader, and it isn't for the diversity. It's for the children who are trying to make this incredible leap from the oral language to the written language, and until they get up and running, to have it match up in some better way for them. And that's the only conversation, I think.
Well, you know, we could do some things to simplify spelling. To spell though, Though, is madness. And so we could do away with some of the things that give kids the most problem. But that's not the issue. The issue is that they learn to recognize words. And, you know, the phonics people think that pronunciation helps, and I'm sure it does help, until 1850. The only way that you could learn to write was through reading. You know, reading aloud, and then that taught you to write. The German philologists, after 1850, found that there were almost no silent readers before 1850. You read aloud because that's the only way you read. The German philologists began to find that it was easier to learn to read silently than it was to pronounce it all the way. And so reading classes after 1850 became classes in silent reading instead of classes in oral reading, which they'd been up until that time.
So in King Alfred's time and in the original Anglo-Saxon, the Anglo-Saxon written form came from Latin scribes.
Well, you have to remember that the standard language from the time of Rome until the Renaissance was always Latin. And any language was set down by people who had been trained in Latin, who knew Latin. So they used the sounds of the alphabet in Latin to write English or French or German or any of those languages. The standard language for 1,500 years was Latin.
Excellent. And by the way, your responses in these nice chunks is beautiful. It takes a lot of time to get people to do that, and you're just doing it naturally, so thank you. Good. So let's move to, so we've got Latin scribes. Let's talk about literacy for a moment, as best you're able to. I've heard other people comment that at the time of the Middle Ages, the so-called Dark Ages, that literacy in Europe was a 1 or 2% tops. Do you have anything on that?
Well, but that was Latin too.
That was all Latin.
It was all Latin.
Because the literacy was in the church, and the church spoke Latin.
Well, see, the church followed the Roman Empire. Latin was established when Rome was still the preeminent power in Europe. Then the church moved in, and the Pope became the emperor, and all of the church documents were in Latin. So there's a continuity from 100 BC to 1500 AD of Latin being the standard language.
Good. 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 Okay, so we have people that grew up inside the Latin language, as the language as the environment that they think in, that they hear sounds in, and these people are have a church bias for the most part, and now they are beginning the process of transcribing this English oral peasant language. what you call a patois, which, by the way, do explain patois for those of us in the majority who don't understand the word.
Well, a patois is a language in which there is no writing system. Peasants speak patois because they can't write. As soon as they learn to write, they will use some system which is derived from Latin. In a sense, all of the European languages were adaptation of the Latin grammar and of the Latin alphabet.
So let's go back again to this point where these Latin scribes are from, operating inside the structure of a church, thinking in Latin, listening to sound distinctions in Latin, begin writing down initially church-related business.
It isn't important when it's church-related. It's when they begin to keep their records in the vernacular that we move toward a vernacular standard. The church has nothing to do with it.
No, only insofar, I only say that insofar as connecting with another piece which shows that the first appearance of written English of any form is church-related document.
That's right.
Right? But yes, as far as that being, that's a closed universe. That doesn't crest over to become part of what's the driving force for standardization.
Right.
That doesn't occur until King Alfred's time, when the early Anglo-Saxon language is being used more extensively by business.
Well, they began to write documents. They began to have contracts in English. They left their wills in English. That's the time that English writing begins to be standardized.
But then that is eclipsed by the French takeover.
In 1066, the Normans came in. The Normans had used a Germanic language till 200 years earlier. Why the Normans picked up French as quickly as they did, we don't know. Because in England, the Normans brought the French with them, and they used French for all of their documents until 1400. The aristocracy was still speaking in French in 1350.
So the business of running England, the monarchy, what would be the beginnings of parliaments, the legalistic operations, the very central heart of the literal organization of the country wasn't in English, it was in French.
Chancery was all of the public servants in the Middle Ages. Chancery was the people who served the king. And Chancery carried all of its business on in English. I have a book here, which is the Anthology of Chancery English, in which we went over to England to the Public Record Office, went through the records. All of the records have been summarized in English. They don't tell you what the original language was. The clerks in the Public Record Office were fascinated with what my wife and myself were doing, because we were going through, you know what a file is. A file is a bunch of sheets of paper, of vellum, tied in one corner with a little string, and the filium is the Latin word for string. So a file is the number of pages that have been tied together. Well, we were going through these files and turning all of these English documents up, and the clerks had no notion that they had these English documents in their files. So at Christmas time, they took us out to a pub, and we had a big lunch, and we were telling them about all of the English that they had in their files, and they had no notion that they had this English there.
Fascinating. Particularly, so file comes from filium, which comes from Latin word for string.
Latin word for string.
So I want to really get people to understand that there was this emergence of a written English that was becoming standardized, but then it got knocked out for a couple hundred years.
Well, it wasn't that language Well, that language was knocked out, and that language never came back again. The Normans used French. Anglo-Saxon, standard Anglo-Saxon disappeared. When they began to write English after 1500, they based it on what people were speaking at that time, which had nothing to do with Anglo-Saxon.
Good, good. All right. So now let's go to that point. It's been a couple hundred years. Is anything that you can say about that, to reiterate that point about the time when the language was French and English writing didn't exist? It didn't exist. And then the more detailed conversation about King Henry IV and V and the emergence of Chancery and that transition. So let's go back to that point and come forth with whatever you can there.
Well, as I say, Chancery was the record-keeping part of government, and Chancery was in French and Latin until 1400. All of this correspondence, even of Henry IV, was still in French. Henry V began to use English for his correspondence, and the king's correspondence was really the way in which law was laid down. The king would write letters to London, he'd write letters to Bristol, he'd write letters to York.
So we got every 30 minutes to watch out. Okay. So let's back up to the point where the king's writing establishes the standard.
Well, the clerks in Chancery, in this book about Chancery English, we have one letter by Henry V in English. And it's amazing how closely the Chancery spellings and grammar are to what Henry V was using. I won't say that Standard English is based upon the language of Henry V, but he was the most influential figure in standardizing the language.
So let's talk about the Chancery Scribes. How many there were? Tell me about their mechanism, how they grew, whether...
In the book you have there, I have a chapter on Chancery. There were about 120 Chancery Scribes in 1400. And the writing of this 120 people laid the foundation for Standard English. Now, of course, there have been many changes since 1400, but it's amazing. I set this on the computer so we could count all of the spellings. And at the back of the book, I have a glossary with the various spellings for every word. And it's amazing how often the Chancery Scribes established the spelling that we still use. S-I-G-N, T-H-O-U-G-H, N-I-G-H-T, K-N-I-F-E. All of these are Chancery spellings, which we haven't got rid of yet.
That's great. So, Cori asked the question, I think it's a great one. Why would they spell it like that? Why did they spell the way they spelled?
Well, they spelled the way they spelled because these were the pronunciations in 1400. Though, which we pronounce though, to Chaucer was thoch. And K-N-I-F-E to Chaucer would have been canif. We have changed the pronunciation without changing the spelling in a great many cases.
So you're saying that originally the way the spelling was used would have been much more phonetic?
It would have been phonetic. When it was introduced in the 15th century, from 1400 to 1500, it was a phonetic spelling. But the language, the pronunciation has continued to change since that time. And, in many cases, we've changed the spelling. But in many cases, we're still using the spelling for the pronunciation in 1400.
map over of sound to letters was, I mean, let's go back to this point where we've got these Latin scribes, people trained in Latin. They're inventing the written English. They've got an ear for Latin sound distinctions, and they're applying the alphabet and its sound distinctions from Latin to words they're hearing in English.
We're still doing this all the time with the Latin alphabet. If you do a translation of the Bible into, some African language, you'll use the Latin alphabet, and you'll use the sounds in the Latin alphabet to approximate the sounds that they're using in this African language. So every time we create a spelling now, we create the spelling by using the Latin sounds for the sounds we think we hear in these languages that we're creating.
So how many people are speaking English? If we could look at a kind of reading and writing in English, the ramp. In the 1400s, you're talking about a couple hundred people, 1,000?
Oh no, everybody in England was speaking English in 1400. And everybody in English, the ordinary people didn't learn to write in English for another couple of hundred years. We see more and more of them writing in the 15th century and the 16th century. And English doesn't really become a written language till they begin to teach it in school after 1700. Dr. Johnson and people in his time did the first dictionaries, and that's when they began to standardize spelling. But that's after 1700, you see.
This is after the printing press and the King James Bible and the drive to...
But the printing in English in Shakespeare's time was still full of variation. It wasn't a bit standard.
So let's talk about the forces that standardized spelling as you understand them as they came in. So there's both the printing press at one level.
The printing press did more to standardize it than anything else. And they did it because it's much easier to read if a word is spelled the same way every time. If though is spelled Though one time, and Thow the next time, and Tho the next time, we have a hard time recognizing it as though. So we want our words to be spelled the same way every time because it eases spelling. It really doesn't matter what the spelling is, as long as it's consistent.
Well, to a good reader, it doesn't really matter what the spelling is. To somebody who's struggling and who doesn't know the word for the first time.
Well, the more literate society is, the harder it is to standardize spelling, to modernize spelling. Because we're used to reading it as Though. And, if I'm reading a page and there are 2 or 3 spellings for that word, this is annoying to me.
Back to the scribes for a minute. These scribes that are transcribing English at the time, I mean, they are not... They don't care for English as a language in the same way they care for Latin and care for French.
No person wrote English as a first form of writing until after 1700. Up until that time, everybody who wrote was educated in Latin, and then he began to write in English. There is no such thing as a native English scribe, as a native English writer, until after 1700. And, they'd been writing English for 200 years by that time.
It was still, English was the second language.
Well, if you go to any of the manuscripts of Milton, the spellings in Milton's manuscripts are very different. He didn't spell consistently, regularly. He spelled in different ways. We don't know how Shakespeare spelled because we don't have anything that he wrote. but he would have spelled his language, the same word would appear in 2 or 3 spellings on a page in Milton, and I'm sure in a paragraph in Shakespeare. That's why Dr. Johnson is so important. Until you had a dictionary giving you a standard spelling, you didn't think much about spelling. You knew that you were simply approximating in the Latin alphabet what you thought you heard in English.
And again, these people are, to a significant extent, we think in our primary oral language. We conceptualize that way.
Mm-hmm.
We hear the sound of the words in that language. So what I'm hearing you say is that during this time when English is emerging, the primary bias of the people that are writing it is in English. It's like English is a second language.
That's right.
As English is beginning.
And that second language would be entirely different in any county in England. What they heard in their ears was the Kentish dialect or the Hertfordshire dialect or the Yorkshire dialect. There was no such thing as standard pronunciation, even for people who were educated. They were educated in their Latin pronunciation and in their Latin spelling. But if they came from Yorkshire, all the English they knew was Yorkshire. There was no reason for a Yorkshireman to hear the sounds of Kentish in his ears. So it's really when the dictionaries and writing in English becomes part of the educational system after 1700 that you begin to have standardization.
How many people were English literate in the 16th century? Any idea?
Well, very few. I couldn't even guess. If 4 or 5% of the population was literate, that's a high percentage. Business was all carried on orally until, 1800 or 1900.
So let's go back to your story for a minute. You're actually discovering this. You didn't set out to discover these correlations. You discovered these correlations because of recognizing patterns in these old manuscripts that you were looking at.
That's right. And the manuscripts are nothing like the printed editions. What an editor does is to regularize. The manuscripts have very different spelling. What interested me was that you could tell that people who had any connection with Chancery were much more regular than the people who didn't have any connection with Chancery. That's why I began to talk about Chancery Standard.
And so the standardization of, even before the spelling standardization that would come with Priestley and the dictionaries later, the standardization of writing English that emerges inside the court, inside the most official business of the land.
The sounds on which the Chancery scribe based their English was not their own pronunciation. It was the court pronunciation. The king and the nobleman pronounced English in a certain way, and the scribes began to adapt that pronunciation for their spelling. This, of course, is still the case with French. French have a very elite pronunciation in Paris with the elite part of society, and so the spelling is based upon that elite pronunciation.
Right. This is great, John. So when we say that the original Chancery Scribes were writing in a way that was phonetic to the sound at the time, it's a strange phonetic in that it's a phonetic through the ears of somebody who's using the Latin sounds and the Latin alphabet while listening to what they consider to be a kind of peasant oral lingo that's lesser, so to speak.
Well, but nobody was trying to write down the patois that the peasants were speaking. Everybody in England was speaking English. Businessmen, the court, everybody was speaking English. And nobody, it was the year 2000 before we began to set down peasant dialects. Nobody was interested in writing peasant dialects in 1800 or 1850. They were writing their own pronunciation, and they were basing their own pronunciation after Dr. Johnson on what they considered university pronunciation to be, or court pronunciation to be.
I think we've covered most of what I need.
Right behind you. So children see the word knife and want to say kniff or knife.
Knief
Knife, the way that it was pronounced, and today.
and
they say-
knowledge.
and today, or knee, right? Like your knee. This is really how it was pronounced.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And they, once we teach them their letters, I think they have an instinct to say it like that. But then we're now telling them, no, that's wrong. It's not that word. How confusing. How confusing for these children.
Well, it would be much simpler if we could do some basic spelling modernization, get rid of the KNs, get rid of the SIGNs, get rid of the OUGHs. There are only about 50 or 75 spellings that if we change them would make spelling enormously enormously simpler for people who were learning to read English and write English. That would be a good thing. But the society is too literate now. If the society weren't this literate, we might be able to change them. But all the people who read now want to see those spelled THOUGH. They don't want to see it spelled some other way. So you can say, we're going to simplify spelling, but most of the people who know how to read and write are going to refuse to do it, and so it won't be done.
Yeah, that's the whole history of it, right? We've had hundreds of years of spelling reform attempts that have never gotten anywhere, culminating in the 1906 fiasco with Roosevelt. There's just too much inertia. I mean, look around in your own library here. I mean, right? There's just too many people that too much of an investment in the way things are.
PMLA, the literary journal that I edited for 15 years, is written by scholars for scholars. In the period of spelling simplification, 1900, they decided that they would publish PMLA in simplified spelling. They did it for 2 issues, and the membership simply went up in arms and said, we won't have our PMLA using this kind of spelling, and so they went back to standard spelling.
Yep. And then Mark Twain and others came in and said, well, we've got to change the alphabet. And back and forth it goes between change the alphabet, change the spelling. And I mean, today there are organizations, as you're probably aware, around the world that are engaged in efforts to simplify the spelling of it.
Well, other countries have done much more of it than we have. French has done much more. Italian has done much more. The more centralized the government is, the better luck it has with simplifying spelling. We've simply been too democratic.
It must be said, and I think Zaneski says this well, as do some others, that the confusion at one level leads to a exercise, a kind of mental exercise that has led to the ascendancy of a particular kind of abstract mind in the English language that's unique. This confusion, on the one hand, being a barrier to children taking off and can be determining their fate in life. For those that move on through it, something about learning how to deal with all of these ambiguities is exercising and enabling a certain capacity of mind that's uniquely English.
Well, elementary education is devoted to teaching us not to pay any attention to the spelling. You know, when we see the person sitting in the library lip reading, we think, oh, what an uneducated person, because he's lip reading. He's making sounds as he reads that page. We consider every educated person a person who has gotten away from lip reading.
It's a unique perspective. I mean, and yet, when we say getting away from, that implies that at some level, almost everybody has to go through it.
Well, we have these spellings, and so we have spelling bees still, and the people who win the spelling bees go to Washington, where they have contests with spelling. Spelling is very, very important to us.
Yes, but spelling is unheard of in a phonetic language. It's unnecessary.
Well, no, in a phonetic language, the spelling in Atlanta would be totally different from the spelling in Boston. That's why we don't want phonetic spelling. I want to read books that are published in Boston as well as books that are published in Atlanta.
You're talking about bridging the dialect differences.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But in Mexico, there's very little concern with spelling bees because the language is, the spelling is self-evident from the letter-sound correspondence.
Mm-hmm.
Between 1066 and 1400, there's a point in your book that I really liked. Thinking about the soul of England. Remember that passage?
The soul.
It is interesting to think about the soul of England between 1066 and 1400 in terms of its language. Two populations, the small ascendancy in the French and the large population in English, and how they're working this out.
Mm-hmm.
And you said that the rich Anglo-Saxon vocabulary for government law, theology, poetry, and culture atrophied.
I didn't hear you well enough. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. You speak to the Anglo-Saxon vocabulary atrophying, and that the emergence of written English has this absorption of French words because the English oral language didn't have the vocabulary range necessary to conduct modern business.
If you'll count the words in the dictionary, 50% of them have Romance bases and 50% of them have Anglo-Saxon bases. And the Anglo-Saxon are what we use all the time. You know, as we speak to each other, about 90% of our words are Anglo-Saxon. But in the dictionary, 50% of the words are Anglo-Saxon and 50% are Romance.
By Romance, primarily you mean Latin and French.
Well, originally Latin, but many of them come from French, and others come from Italian and Spanish.
Good. Underneath this, there's a quote, what cannot be from Colin Morris. A quote of yours from Colin Morris where he said, what cannot be verbalized can scarcely be thought.
That's true. But that has very little to do with literacy. Children imagine things, tell stories, and they can tell stories and imagine things just as well before they learn to read and write as after they learn to read and write.
Right, but the distinctions and range and complexity of the stories that they can make are
Sure.
regulated by their oral language,
Sure.
which is developed ultimately by the written language.
Well, I'm sure that my vocabulary in the written language is much, much larger than my vocabulary in the spoken language. There are words that I see in writing that seeing and reading that I would never think of saying.
There was we kind of touched on this earlier, but there was a moment in the conversation on the phone. There was a moment in your phone conversation where you said that the alphabet we use was not made for English.
That's right. That's right. It was made for Latin. That's why we don't know how to pronounce T-H-A-N. Is it than, or then, or thane? We don't know how to pronounce it. We don't know how to pronounce A-C-H-E. Is it ake, or H, or och?
And you say that because this is the ambiguity of the letter sounds inherited from the
Latin. And see, we've had a subsequent change in pronunciation in English, the great vowel shift. You've heard of that. And so all of the I's, long I's in English are ice and nice and dice. Always in French and Italian and Spanish, it's is and nice and dies because they're still using the Latin I, not the great vowel shift I.
What drove the great vowel shift?
Nobody knows. There's been much argument about that. None of the linguists know. They know it went on between Chaucer's time and Shakespeare's time. But what in that 15th century led to this change in pronunciation, nobody knows. You know, you can read articles about this all the time, but
What is your opinion?
no. It's just an interesting drift. It was a drift in pronunciation, but I don't know what led to that drift.
As that line that I just quoted you of saying that the alphabet we use was not made for English, as that was a quote of you, would you feel comfortable saying that, some kind of variation on that full quote on the camera?
Oh, no, I would stand by that sentence, and I suspect almost all linguists would agree with that. This isn't anything unusual.
No, for sure. Let me set it up differently. We were in our oral conversation. What we were saying was that the struggle for children is the confusion between learning the letter names, the alphabet letter names. They don't have a problem with that, right? A, B, C. It's like naming dog, cat, shoe, mom, dad, book. No problem naming the letters. But when the letters get put together into these units called words, the letter sounds that go with those letters no longer work. And this is confusing to the children. They think there's something wrong with them because they're confused. This is where you said the alphabet wasn't created.
Well, we should simplify the American spelling system the way that the French have simplified theirs and the way that the Italians have simplified theirs. And as I said, I've never made a count, but I'll bet there wouldn't be more than 100 letter combinations that would have to be simplified. The OUGH forms, the KN forms. Oh, I can't think of another one right now, but there are 2 or 3 others.
The statement that the alphabet we use was not created for English, as you said, no linguist would probably argue with that, right? But the general population, the parents who don't understand why their children are struggling, to hear that is like, what do you mean the alphabet we use wasn't created for English? This is not in, this might be in someone who specializes and is learning their way into this, but for parents who see their kids struggling, why would they think anything else?
This is part of your responsibility. You've taken it on now.
Right. What we keep doing is trying to get you to actually re-say, well, of course, what you said in the phone conversation was, well, of course, the alphabet wasn't made for English. And we're trying to find different ways to make you say that on the camera. Okay?
So, because that's a clip that we would
Yeah.
definitely use.
So we don't want to ask you to be contrived, but we're trying to do that.
Yeah, I'll try as well as I can. I would just say the sentence, but that wouldn't satisfy you. You want it to come out in the course of conversation.
No, you can try saying the sentence. That'd be great.
The alphabet that we use to write English now was not created for English. It was created for Latin.
Excellent. All right, that does that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a
Well
beautiful point that I think so much of our society is just not understanding that at all.
Yeah, and the other thing that people just generally don't get is that this is not something that we've had forever to work out. This is a relatively brand new problem, and that the root of this English letter sound system correspondence is being handled by, less than a few hundred people a few hundred years ago, and people who really didn't care about English. And out of their work and their machinations,
Sorry.
no.
Quite all right.
Lay the seeds of, this confusing learning process that has seriously harmed 100 million people. I mean, as you know, in China right now, today, there's 100 million adults struggling to learn to read English. They just mandated the law over there that all children will learn to read English.
And they want them to learn to read English because people in Canton can't understand people in Peking now. They have 5 dialects in China, just like we have 5 Romance dialects in Europe. They all use the same written system. It isn't a spelling system. So whatever is written in China, in Canton, you can understand in Peking. But if a Cantonese speaks to you, you can't understand what he's saying.
Interesting, the symmetries. You say that there's 5 basic dialects?
In China, yes.
And there's 5 basic dialectal variations in the Romance languages.
Right.
I keep encountering symmetries between the emergence of the alphabet and the Chinese writing systems. And now there's 5 variations.
Well, these terms, 5, are linguist terms. There aren't just 5 Romance languages, there are 5 Romance written languages. But the people who speak Basque, the people who speak Lithuanian, the people who speak other dialects, from town to town in Europe, you can understand each other. But once you cross a political boundary, then they go to school in a different language, and the language changes. The language doesn't change in the oral use anywhere in England because everybody can understand everybody else on the oral level locally.
No, I get that. I am interested, though, in the writing system, the distinctions that have happened in the writing system.
But that's always political. Always political.
It's always driven by some central bureaucratic force.
Mm-hmm. And it's important that it be regularized. Otherwise, we couldn't write wills and we couldn't write contracts and be able to understand what they mean in the next town and be able to understand what they mean 100 years from now. We want the language to be standardized. For practical purposes, it has to be standardized.
There's no ability to have a conversation and go, wait a minute, I don't get what you mean there. right? If it's on paper and one person wrote it and other people got to read it, there's got to be clear, unambiguous way to be in sync.
The interesting thing is that in countries like India and China, the most standardization they can find is in English. They don't have a standard that they're willing politically to accept in their own language. So they go to English and they write their contracts and they write their novels in English because there's no political involvement there.
Short circuits their argument.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, I think we're in good shape. Is there anything you want to add?
Nope.
Anything we didn't cover that you think is important?
No. I don't know what you'd want covered. I'm glad to cover anything that I can say, but
Yeah, no, you've done really wonderful. I wanted to go over the conversation we had on the phone. I think we've covered all of those points, yeah. And capture you for posterity on the video.
good. Very good.
Thank you so much. Anything else that you can do?
Can you make a duplicate of this in that little tape that you could leave with me? Because I can go right down to the university and they can make it on a tape that I could use in my machine. Now, if it's difficult, don't do it. You said you'd do it when you got home. But I was thinking if it's a thing that can be done immediately, I would like a copy of this one, and I can just go down the street and they'll make me a copy that I can use in my machine.
We can't. There's no way to copy from this to we only have this one camera with us. When we get back to our local base, we can set up a second camera and pump